Hello, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. My name is Jules Simon, and I'm a philosopher at the University of Texas at El Paso.
My name is Kim Diaz, and I'm a philosopher at EPCC.
And we're continuing our series on studying aesthetics and beauty. And today we're really happy to welcome Sanna Lehtinen from Helsinki, Finland. And she works as a research fellow in the Transdisciplinary Arts Studies unit at the Aalto University School of Arts, Design, and Architecture. She's also a docent of aesthetics at the University of Helsinki. Sanna's research focuses on urban environmental aesthetics and the philosophy of the city. And her current research interests include aesthetic sustainability, transgenerational aesthetics, and aesthetics of new urban technologies. She's currently a co-director of the Philosophy of the City Research Group, co-editor-in-chief of the Philosophy of the City Journal, and an assistant editor of Contemporary Aesthetics. Welcome, Sanna. We're really happy to have you all the way from Finland.
Thank you, Jules. Thanks, Kim. It's really nice of you to have me here.
Oh, we're delighted. So we've been working on aesthetics, and we sent you a list of questions, and just to set the context a little bit, we send the same list of questions, almost the same, to everybody. But we're really interested in your kind of work because you're working on what's called urban aesthetics, and that's your primary focus, it seems, anyway. Keeping that in the back of our minds, what is beauty? What do you think beauty is? What's beauty about?
Well, of course, coming from aesthetics in general, I'm interested in aesthetic beauty, like specifically. So what we find pleasure in and like when it is perceived through the senses mostly. Because I always like to remind my students, for example, that there are also different other branches of beauty that could be of interest and that kind of complicate the picture a little more. But with aesthetic beauty, I think what attracts our attention in the first place are most often the formal features of whatever we are sensing. So in visual things, it might be colors and forms and shapes and the way in which things kind of appear to us. But then also beauty is about multisensory perception. So we find tactile experiences pleasurable as well and auditive, as we all know from music. But when it comes to aesthetics and our perception of beauty, it's not only about the surface level either. So we don't only stay on the level of those kind of perceivable qualities of things that we are assessing, but we really tend to attach meanings to those perceptions. So we attach meanings and values to whatever we are seeing and hearing and feeling and touching in our world. And when I mentioned these other branches of beauty, they can refer to functional beauty. So whenever something just really works, whenever things click and when they fulfill their purpose. So that is also something that we tend to give almost like this sort of beauty-related, aesthetics-related kind of judgment on that. And then we also discuss moral issues with the terminology coming from aesthetics. So if we behave in a beautiful way, if we act tactfully towards others, so that is also kind of we behave nicely to each other. So it gives this kind of ethical dimension to beauty. And then there is rational beauty as well. So when mathematical theorems or a chess play, for example, could be consisting of beautiful moves, or coding. I don't know if either of you do coding as a hobby or like that, but it's something that we also tend to kind of see that something just works in a very pleasurable way.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a very broad sort of setting of the question. And you started right off about talking about sensory perception, but then moved into the more philosophically oriented understandings of what beauty is all about. That was great. That was a nice opening to our dialogue. You want to?
Yeah, I would like to ask. The direction of your life, right, is directed towards beauty and aesthetics. Why do you think the people live in the cities where you're thinking about beauty? Why is it important for the citizens of those cities to think about beauty?
Well, for me, having worked on aesthetics for like basically all of my career, I always want to emphasize that beauty or other aesthetic values, they are not only about the surface of things. So it's not only about the kind of cherry on top value that we add whenever something like everything else is in place in our cities, but especially as we come closer to the everyday and living environments of people, it's really about the quality of life. And we go really easily into questions such as who has the who has the right to beautiful living environments, comfortable living environments, pleasurable environments and surroundings. So I think like issues around aesthetics in the urban setting, they're also about social justice and this kind of quality of life and equality among people. So we get into like other values through this kind of window that aesthetics gives us.
Oh, that's another great answer, because there's a lot of buzz or a lot of attention drawn to right to the city, or social justice issues and urban environments and environmental justice. But then that little addition that you make, who has the right to a beautiful environment and to enjoy their lives their daily lives in this aesthetic way, who has that kind of a right? That really puts a different twist on normal considerations, usual considerations of social justice. Yeah, that's really nice.
And I think aesthetics in the kind of context of everyday life is important precisely because it might be even very small things. They tend to accumulate in the flux of everyday life. If there is something that we really encounter on a daily basis, it becomes meaningful to us. So this kind of familiarity, which is also inbuilt in our perceptions, it kind of tends to emphasize things. So that's why everyday aesthetics is in a way fundamental to me. Although like these high level experiences related to art are also very kind of nice and extraordinary, and they bring a lot of quality and like pleasurable experiences, but the everyday is very fundamental on the aesthetic level as well.
I wonder what a society that was centered gave a higher value to aesthetics when it thinks about how to distribute, right, the benefits and burdens of living in a society. Do you think it would be more just if it prioritized beauty?
Well, I take, for example, the case of like greenery or like nature in cities. It comes already from very many studies in environmental psychology that people tend to like greenery, green environments. Even just one tree could add like not only shades in sunny areas, but like really sort of quality to the place. It's a living being, but the green also kind of just brings pleasurable tone to the environment itself. And so that could be like an easy example that adding like something that is aesthetically pleasurable, it's most likely also something that supports the urban ecosystem. So it also kind of benefits in a more functional way in the city. So I would say that aesthetics is usually always linked to other values as well. And in the case of urban trees or urban greenery, it's linked to ecological and environmental values. And so in that sense, sometimes focusing on the aesthetic side actually could be very like useful also in this sense of kind of bringing the environmental, ecological, and that way also kind of socially more just features into our current urban designs.
So I've been to Helsinki now a couple of times. Thank you very much for inviting me and some of our colleagues to join you in some of our work in philosophy of the city. And I know your work focuses on this kind of everydayness of our aesthetic experience. So what makes, say, a city like Helsinki a beautiful city? and it is beautiful. There's a lot about Helsinki that could be described as it's a very beautiful city. It has that kind of natural integration of the green sort of environmental concerns. It's situated on the waterfront. What else about Helsinki, since you're there all the time?
Yeah, well, thank you as a person living in Helsinki, and thanks. I also appreciate my city, but I also like to emphasize that I don't think it would be very fair or correct or like even aesthetically like actually working to try to say that only like certain cities would be aesthetically pleasurable. So I think we also need to take into consideration like a lot of different types of cultural, geographical differences and the fact that cities are in a way born and develop in very different ways. What is very nice in the Nordic cities might be the scale, so it's somehow still manageable. So if you think of like commute or transportation, the distances are not like overwhelming, so you can manage your life quite nicely. I think that adds to the quality of life, and also aesthetically might add to the kind of quality, because there is the time consumed in transportation is not that long. And another fact is also maybe the that nature, it's quite close by still. So like within 15 minutes you can easily get to an urban forest or a park like big enough for you to kind of enjoy and have a break there. But I think that is maybe something that could be common, or like that could be kind of created also in other places. But I think like different types of cities around the globe, different metropolises, like even big cities, they have their own distinct features that could be like aesthetically as pleasant, although very, very different, like from a very different perspective.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to Helsinki, I rented a bike. And I I did it after I took a bike tour of the city. So it's not like I just see picture postcards. I actually explored the city by bike, and then actually took a bike and rode into the countryside. So I know exactly what you're talking about. It's very easy to get out into old growth forests, even. It's pretty amazing.
Well, I think that all of us appreciate that which we find beautiful, right? Which is different for everybody. Is there a group of philosophers that is doing research on how to help people in cities have more appreciation, or learn how to appreciate, huge things? It could just be the shade of a tree, but to be aware that appreciate the sounds or appreciate the smells. How can we, and is there worth even, in fostering a sense of appreciation for things, for that which is beautiful?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And yes, there like is currently like interest in aesthetic. Well, there has been for a long time, but again, renewed interest in aesthetic sensibility. And that really relates to the realm of the everyday. So how to appreciate all the familiar things again in the everyday environment, or the objects or artifacts or relations between people, like all the very nuanced small things, this sort of which we have called the aesthetic undertone of everyday life. But then also that kind of links to the idea that if we live in cities, if we live in these very kind of diverse places, how to understand the perspectives of others, and how to appreciate, how to learn to understand something that maybe goes against our own liking, how to be open to the ideas of others. And although like there is this common saying that like beauty is in the eye of the beholder and so on, that beauty would be very subjective, I think even though our like likings, even though our appreciation might be directed towards different things, I think there are like enough similarities in the processes by which we get into these preferences and likings, that we are able to kind of access the world through the senses of others. And I think cities are quite like good and emblematic places for these kinds of interactions. So we really get to kind of understand and appreciate maybe even something that we don't personally find necessarily like beautiful or that interesting aesthetically, like in the first place, but we learn to appreciate through these interactions with others.
Do you have some examples for you or others foster that kind of appreciation, that kind of everyday appreciation? Is it something that's done in schools, community organizations? How does that kind of appreciation get kind of spread around, as it were?
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily working on that field so much myself, but I'm a great believer in art education, and that you kind of learn this already starting from a very early age, and it kind of relates on how you use your senses and how you learn to pay attention to things. Because aesthetics, besides being about sensory perception and this multisensory perception, it's also about attention. So what grasps our attention? And this is like the good side of aesthetic, like dimension of life, but it's also a bit risky because we all know of the kind of attention economy and like who shouts the loudest gets the most attention. And we don't want that to be the whole case about the aesthetic phenomena of life. So we also want to kind of learn to kind of appreciate the very nuanced, the very subtle things and the subtle, beautiful things in life. I think that is something that would increase quality of life immensely if you are kind of more open to those like small things, small beauties in life. But besides that, I think art, like the paradigmatic case for philosophical aesthetics, that like, why do we have art in the first place? How does that reflect human life and like how we interpret, how we give meanings to the things in our lives? So art can definitely help to cultivate aesthetic sensibility that can point directions for our attention in a way.
I think this is so interesting because I have worked primarily on social political philosophy, and it's interesting hearing you speak about how art, aesthetics, beauty quickly goes into the social political. Here in El Paso, and we're a border town with Mexico, which is one country, right, and then the US. And so it's two cities and two countries, but we share a border. So sometimes at 9 a.m, one of our neighbors will play really loud our local rock station, you know, and AC/DC is going to be, or Queen is going to be, and they're cleaning the house, right? And so they like to clean the house listening to loud rock music. And another neighbor will put cumbias or merengue, also really loud at 9, 10 in the morning on a Sunday, right? Because they're getting ready to clean the house. And so you have different cultures, different sensibilities about aesthetics. And this whole thing about playing it really loud is just cultural. That's what we like to do here in El Paso. If we fail to be generous to our neighbors, it can quickly turn into a justice and social political issue, right, of different cultures jarring our nerves and us judging them as wrong. So for me, my question about learning how to appreciate each other, right, our different cultures, even just the smell, right, the smell of different cuisines, when you're walking down the street and saying, oh, that smells like curry, that smells great. If we could foster a sense of curiosity in children, right, to be open to learning, or adults, instead of being put off by what is different, you know, just trying to experiment new things.
I think that's a really good example of the music, and I think, yeah, also like the volume level might be like cultural. It might be also open to debate, but musical styles, I think that's an easy access to a very like different mindsets and cultures. So that is something like kind of easily enjoyable and understandable. Yeah, and I think about that cultivation part and curiosity. I think children are like naturally curious. I think all human beings are, but we have also the push and pull between curiosity towards the new, the fascination of the new, which is could be also kind of aesthetic fascination. But then also like we are very kind of like to stick with the habitual things, and like we have our routines and we stick to the familiar things as well. So like how does this like fluctuation between the familiar things and then the inborn like also inborn curiosity of the human mind in a way works towards collaboration and interaction and kind of tolerance and understanding each other's preferences, not only aesthetic ones, but also like just ways of being in the world. But I think aesthetics is an easy access point in many ways because it's related to creativity and artistic phenomena, cultural phenomena, and it's somehow like it's an area where you don't necessarily have to immediately go into the political. So it's also sometimes something where you can kind of touch upon like how could we relate towards each other's. So I have a lot of hope for the aesthetic dimension in that sense.
I think aesthetic activities can tend to foster inclusion as well. Like if you think of gatherings at plazas or a festivity, a festival, or those kinds of exhibits that attract people. And you find a lot of those in urban environments. So because by the nature of the concentration of people, right? But I have a different kind of question, and that has to do with your work in what you call transgenerational aesthetics. So you said you're not you don't work directly in art education, but how does transgenerational aesthetics, what do you do in that sort of activity? Is it technology oriented? Is it beauty oriented? Is it culturally oriented? Is it I hear generational, so is it about kids, old people, geriatrics? What is it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really, really good question. Again, I think it's an important and interesting concept. Like some parts come from like actually intergenerational justice and how that has been dealt, especially in environmental ethics. So like what kind of responsibilities and obligations and duties do we have for the future generations? So all these kind of very heavy words about how we owe the world and planet to our kind of future yet unborn generations of humans. Which is, of course, very, very important. But I'm also interested in the kind of more care ethical perspectives to like intergenerational as a term can actually describe or describes better all the living generations like who live at the same time on this planet. So we can talk of intergenerational living in the sense if grandparents live together with their like children and grandchildren, so that is intergenerational living. But transgenerational refers more to the continuum of different human and non-human generations. So how we could show this kind of care and compassion towards that yet unborn generations of human beings, but also other living beings that will be inhabiting the planet after us. And in aesthetics, especially, I have been interested in how in these kind of transgenerational chains of effect, how aesthetic values change. So what we think of, what we find, maybe not on so much on an individual level, but like socially contestable level, like what we find beautiful, what we find aesthetically valuable as a society, if we can distill those things, and there are certain things that we kind of tend to gravitate towards more, like if they like that we would still retain this kind of sensibility and kind of knowledge that those values are also prone, they can change, they're prone to change, and new generations, like if we think of like 50 years from now, they might find completely other types of things beautiful. So this is something that, because I teach at the design school, so this is something that I really want to use as a helpful tool for like the design students, so that they would in a way design enough flexibility for the future generations to kind of create their own values and like not to like attach too many meanings or like really fixed meanings to the things that they are designing. And especially when we think of cities, of urban aesthetics, I think this kind of transgenerational thinking is very valuable and useful, because cities are not throwaway objects. They are something like the big entities continuously in change and in flux, but also like if we think of buildings, like they are most often built for many generations, and at least that should be the case from the sustainability perspective. So that we kind of keep give the right for the future generations to form their own opinions and preferences. We have no way of knowing how the world will be. Like, we have some ways of knowing, but not nearly enough that we could fix how the world should look like in 50 or 100 years or 500 years.
But we do kind of know that we want to continue to enjoy our lived world, right? That kind of flexibility seems to be fixed in terms of that. I mean, if my life is not enjoyable, I'm not going to want to stay in this or that environment, right? It seems like one of those bedrock values that aesthetics circles around, that our lives have to be enjoyable, in some really important ways.
But I guess that's the point, right? How does that generation choose to enjoy life as opposed to how we choose to enjoy life now?
Yeah, and this is...
I mean, a good example of that would be shopping malls. Here in the US, they're pretty much going out of fashion. Previous generations developed large shopping malls, right, where big stores, Dillard's, Macy's, Sears, and people would go, and whole families would go and take their pictures during Christmas, right? And they had restaurants, and it was a thing to do. But as the economy shifts and preferences shift, a lot of retail now is done online. And so businesses have gone out of business. Yeah, the preference of each generation changes, and so then, but now you have these big structures that are, not being rented, not profitable, and they're there. And so different cities have had to think about, well, what are we going to do with this space that we built? And it's not profitable anymore. What are we going to do with it? So it's interesting.
That's actually a good example, because in the design student case, this kind of flexibility could be designed into shopping centers, that they would be easily adaptable for new kinds of purposes, for new kinds of uses. Or it could be even on a kind of circular economy model, that it could be recyclable, the building materials. Or there is these are some methods of creating this sort of flexibility into the human designed, human made world that doesn't fix too many meanings to the things that we are producing. Because we definitely, I would go for the idea that we need to keep enjoying and finding enjoyment and beauty in life, but we cannot also do that at the cost of nature or natural resources or our planet. So this is one way of also emphasizing or underlining the connection between our aesthetic values and ecological values, for example.
Aesthetic experiences are, especially in urban environments, are very much part of this debate between business-oriented, profit-oriented ventures and private sorts of activities versus public sorts of activities. And so what do you think about this? I mean, as we cultivate an appreciation for the arts and for aesthetic, the quality of our life, what role then do say private agencies or private people play in that kind of scenario versus, say, our governing agencies, our governments, municipal governments, federal governments?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good follow-up question in a way, on many of the topics that we have been discussing. You have to remember, I come from a Nordic country where the building activity, for example, it's very much more regulated, I believe. I think in relation to this kind of transgenerational aesthetics in the urban sphere, how to ascertain that there is enough flexibility aesthetically for the future generations. making sure that there is enough diversity in what we are building, so that like not only buildings in one style or not only one type of like shopping center gets to be like the model for everyone in the city. So I think this might be one way of answering that, like the governing body kind of sees that there is enough diversity in what type of building the city is kind of in engaging, or what is taking place in the city at a certain time. And this is also maybe coming back to the question around the Nordic cities, or like why Helsinki is so pleasurable. I think one thing actually is that it has grown in a way, not maybe organically, that would be like older cities in Central Europe, that they somehow like the planning hasn't been as like kind of present. It has just kind of grown out of the needs of the growing population. So here it is, the history is much younger, so it's much more planned, but still there are like buildings from different ages. And I think that also fosters like diversity in architectural styles and in the functions of the buildings. So usually that gives like good quality also aesthetics wise. It's much more risky in a way to build like an entire neighborhood like at the same time from scratch. That of course also happens, but it's kind of, if we think of it, kind of logically becomes much more risky. So then you have to be much more conscious in creating that diversity simultaneously when you are building the whole neighborhood. And I think there the role of the private sector in the building activity, I'm not sure like if it can be held like completely responsible for that, because it's really like profit ridden. So there has to be some kind of maybe kind of control over it. How to do that, that's another question.
Yeah, as you know, there can be there is this history of overreaching on the part of our governments, though, in what they want to see happen in cities as well. And I'm thinking here of an article I wrote for a journal issue you edited for Contemporary Aesthetics on Haussmannization, right? And it's this forced, violent sort of eviction of the creative class, of the lower classes, and the kind of attempt to create a beautiful city that was then modeled in the United States. I mean, what happened in Paris was then copied and happened in Chicago and in other big cities in the United States.
Is it like gentrification?
It's the attempt to create a beautiful city, and what you do is you tear out all the organic growth of the city, and you create big, broad avenues so people can shop, and so tanks can also go up and down the streets and police the people.
A type of gentrification.
It's kind of like gentrification. It's not quite the same, but because it's done from the top down, it's not buying into the city, and
so is it?
It's more like an enforced aesthetic.
Is it like a city mandated? It's not a private.
Government mandated.
Government mandated change.
Right.
But it's very much like enforcing an aesthetic ideal over an already existing urban structure. So it's a very violent act, and kind of focuses on a certain very, very kind of strong ideal of what a city should be like. And there are these, like you mentioned, like military purposes and like how to make people consume more, and these kinds of ideas behind it. So I think this definitely is a kind of risky example of this sort of top-down management of how our cities should be developing. But I think if you take as a kind of value, not so much like certain ideals or certain aesthetic ideals, but really more like how to foster more diversity, then the approach becomes different from the side of the governing body. Like, you're not saying what is aesthetic quality, you just see that there is like enough variety in it.
It almost becomes like an area of contestation. I mean, that there's going to be forces that are going to attempt to create this monolithic, single narrative or single vision, single ideal sort of thing, versus fostering this kind of diverse
I think that's
potential.
Very interesting, because here on the border we deal with similar issues, right? and I'm looking forward to meeting you in person when you visit. You'll see how it's organically, right? We have these two cities, but then because we are at the border of two different countries, federal narratives get superimposed on the local. So it's very, what you're saying is similar
Oh yeah,
to...
we have a really good example of this, and yeah, for the third time, we're hoping to see you here next year. But we have, you know, our federal government built this big wall, this big steel wall between the two cities, and it wasn't here when I got here or when
I was
Kim
there,
grew
it's
up,
pretty
right?
recent.
Yeah, it's relatively last couple decades, right? But it's this huge wall, and it's created this aesthetic monstrosity between the two cities. But so much so that when I take visitors around to see El Paso, when they come to visit, it's really amazing the way that the city...
You'll get to see it.
Yeah, the way that the city has adapted to it. Like there's parks built next to it, playgrounds for kids grow up with this wall looming over them, you know, with barbed wire on the top, right? Oftentimes there's attempts to create connections. A student of mine did a project on how art crosses the border between the two cities, and some folks set up a seesaw between the two sides.
I've seen the images of those.
You've seen those images, yeah. It's a very strange sort of aesthetic experience. Yeah.
I wanted to not stray too much from what we're speaking about, and ask you this because I guess more overtly, what is the border between what is good and what is beautiful? Is what is good beautiful? Or is what is beautiful good? What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I like the idea of border, in the concrete sense that you were describing, and also in these kind of questions, because borders and walls and these kind of interfaces between things, they are always porous, there are always influences and things going back and forth, and how we relate to those borders. I think that tells much more about us than the borders themselves even. So how do we kind of, as you said, adapt to the situations? And I think in this sense, the possible borders, which in philosophy, also there is this kind of compartmentalization that we try to make borders between ethics and aesthetics. And I think those lines are porous as well. So I always, in the first lectures for my new students, I want to emphasize that aesthetics and ethics are closely interlinked. And I think you might be able to discuss some issues in ethics without aesthetics, but within aesthetics, you're always touching upon also ethical issues. And one way of describing that, whether it relates to the everyday environments or urban questions or even in art, I think a very kind of useful insight is that aesthetic values, or aesthetic features, the aesthetic dimension of human perception and meaning making, it makes other values perceivable. So what we are assessing, what we are judging, what we are perceiving, what we are directing our attention to, what we find interesting, beautiful, ugly, it always kind of tells about other values behind those things as well. So that's why I think, we cannot make equations such as beauty is the same as good, but beauty is a kind of window and an opening to discuss also the ethical qualities. And I think in the sense that they are not like permanent ethical truths about things, but they are about how we relate to things, how we do relate on an individual, from an individual point of view as persons, but also more as a community, for example. How do we deal with things? What kind of aesthetic impact do our ethical decisions have around our urban environments? Well, you were talking about the wall. That's that's come up as a chain of results where there are many kind of instances of ethical deliberation, and what has come out of those chains of decisions is the wall. So the wall is the aesthetic imprint. It's the mark in the city that kind of tells about the ethical decisions made by not maybe everyone, but by the people who are making those decisions. So in that sense, I want to always emphasize that aesthetics, it's a vehicle for other values to come through to us, and it's an opening for us to discuss those other values as well.
And it may be easier to get people on the same page aesthetically, or at least be willing to try experiencing something new aesthetically, so that because when it comes to ethics and political ideas, we humans have very strong opinions and we're not very likely to even try being open or receptive to considering the opposite view, right? Because we already know that they're wrong. And so, but aesthetically, it might be easier to get someone to try a different cuisine, or to, hey, listen to this, let's watch this movie. And then that is an opening for dialogue and possibly transformation, right?
Yeah, and I like the idea that like philosophy in general, in my mind, but aesthetics maybe in particular, like one way of cultivating that sensibility is also linked to the fact that we can in a way postpone our judgment. Like we don't always have to come up with an opinion. Like we might have like instant opinions about things, but then we might be like, okay, I will step up, like take one step back, and I will try to understand why someone else might see it in a completely different light. So in aesthetic matters, like you said, in a way, there might be this sort of it might be easier to train this kind of deliberation between different values, but also like trying to see the other one's perspective. So in that way, it could also serve as an opening to understanding other values.
Oh, I like that response because, I'm whenever I teach Kant, and I teach Kant's aesthetics, he has this universal sort of judgment about it, that if I say something's beautiful, I'm expecting you to agree with me, not step back and say, well, let me just wait a minute. Let's talk about this, right? There's this kind of expectation of agreement versus this invitation to kind of discuss and have a dialogue about, well, is this really beautiful? What constitutes what you like about it, and what you don't like about it, and something like that.
Yeah, I don't know if this makes me like a post-Kantian or what, but I really think that it's an aesthetic dimension of human life, could be an invitation into kind of discussing these other opinions.
Yeah, an invitation versus a confrontation, right?
But also, and I want to say two things, but also when I've already made up my mind that I don't like it, right? It's ugly, it's offensive. And then if I have someone else who can tell me, well, wait, hold on, maybe you haven't tried it this way. And all along I've been using wasabi the wrong way, right? Or hot mustard the wrong way. And that's why it's offensive to me, because I don't really know how to use it in a way that adds to the flavor of the food, right? So that was one thing. And the other was, because you work also on the connection between quality of life and aesthetics, I think I would like to hear what you have to say about the connection between happiness and beauty.
I think that's a very, very good question. I tend to, like in my teaching, somehow emphasize, I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but it makes this easy distinction that kind of psychology, like psychological theories on aesthetics, they focus on the emotions, like and even sometimes like equate beauty, like that beauty is a pleasurable emotion that we get out of pleasurable, perceived pleasurable things or something like that. But I think beauty, or whatever other aesthetic qualities we find in our everyday environment, for example, it's something that can cause an emotion. And happiness is a very kind of strongly positive emotion, something that we are, of course, in a way searching, but I also think that human beings are very kind of complex beings, and we also strive for kind of meaningful experiences and not only happiness in our life. But ultimately, if we want to think about happiness and sustaining certain level of happiness, because I don't think you can stay happy all the time, it's like comes and goes, but like at least see that there is like the preconditions of happiness would exist, then we need to think about what constitutes like good life in general, and how to contribute, how can philosophy, how can aesthetics contribute to human flourishing. And this is something that has been studied in everyday aesthetics through the notion of aesthetic well-being. So as part of like more general kind of understanding of what human well-being consists of. So the aesthetic dimension is one part of it. And if our well-being is on a good level, we are like more likely to experience happiness as well. But this comes again back to the kind of fluctuation between very kind of familiar mundane experiences and then the kind of ordinary aesthetic, the aesthetic undertone of everyday life that kind of builds this sort of long-term contentment, aesthetic contentment and well-being in our life. But then there are these aesthetic highlights which can come from art or culture in general, or entertainment, or like we all know these kind of very even extreme aesthetic like experiences of aesthetic interest, like a rock concert, for example. It's like a huge burst of aesthetically interesting things happening, and that can create quite fast moments and experiences of happiness. But there is this idea in the kind of theories on aesthetic well-being that you cannot build happiness or human well-being only on these kind of extraordinary experiences, but you really again go back to the everyday, more mundane, more nuanced things, and together all these would create conditions also for long-term happiness, or happiness being more likely to be present in life.
Well, that leads then into this, and I might circle back to some of our earlier parts of our dialogue. But the work that you do and your interest in technology and urban aesthetics, you can't build into our potential experiences these kinds of happiness-inducing sorts of phenomena. But is there a way to address, through design, through architecture, through technology in urban environments, a way that we can engineer our environments in such a way that would induce towards more meaningful experiences? You know, is that something you take into account, or something you've considered or studied or experienced or written about?
Well, I find happiness a somewhat like slippery concept, maybe also because in Finnish we have actually two words for that. So it's not only one happiness, there is like this, the other word that we use maybe refers more to that kind of this sort of enjoyment, so that something lights up in you when you get this like intense burst of happiness, and then there is this more kind of stable happiness, which is called onni or onnellisuus. And I think this is also something that comes up in the happiness index, like when Finland is every now and then like very ranked high up in the happiness index, and we are ourselves like, what? Like we're not the happiest nation like on many meters, but somehow this sort of overall contentment level is very high. So I think it's actually a language confusion. But if you think of urban design, for example, I would again go for this sort of like diversity. So if you create conditions for many different types of users, for the elderly, for people with disabilities, for children, for nursing mothers, however you kind of find these all different ways of needing spaces in the city, and if you contribute to like those spaces existing there, I think that would be kind of one way of making sure that that you see different generations in the city. You don't have empty squares and so on. So you kind of starts building this sort of like scaffolds towards more meaningful community life. So I think that might be one recipe for creating more happy citizens through aesthetic means. Urban design is like functions on the aesthetic realm really a lot. It's not only about whether a park bench looks beautiful, but it's also about how useful it is and how we perceive it and what kind of what kind of affordances do we read to the bench and how we determine it to be used and whether it's inviting for us and so on. So design is never kind of innocent in that way. It's functions on the aesthetic level, but it also tells so much more to us as the users of those designs. So I think that could be one way of linking again beauty, aesthetic values, and happiness, and one way of making happiness at least more likely.
Well, I want to make one observation about your response, and I would say that perhaps in Finnish it's not a language confusion, but a language blessing to have multiple words for happiness. And I was thinking, as you said that, perhaps we can capture that with something like satisfaction. I'm satisfied with my life. I have contentment. Therefore, I can have these experiences of great joy or more, pleasure or things like that.
I think it's about the baseline.
The baseline, right? Yeah, sort of baseline. We're drawing to a close. Do you have questions for us about, well, our experience here today, happiness, aesthetics, dialogue?
I have to say that I really like the topic of the dialogue, and I think that really comes nicely close to the idea of aesthetics as an interface, not only with the world, but like also between different individuals. And I couldn't help but notice also the question about peace in your list, and I think that is something that, again, really like kind of is peace beautiful and goes really nicely together with the ideas of happiness and how to kind of create conditions for human flourishing and how that could be like meaningful concept also from the aesthetic point of view. But I don't know, I wanted to ask maybe you, like, how do you see this connection between peace and dialogue and living in the border and fostering also aesthetics as an important part of it?
That's one of our culminating issues, actually. We're looking to figure out, because of our own orientation, creating more peace in the world is one of our priorities.
But it starts with us, right?
Right.
And so when you were speaking about the everydayness, right? I'm all for it. And I wonder if it's a matter of getting older, that just finding joy in a cup of coffee, right? Or in watching the sunrise is now, right, what I find the everydayness is more valuable than 20 years ago when the rock concert was really like the happiness, right? And because peace can also be boring, and so not aesthetically stimulating, right? And so how do we, for me it's interesting to teach my students about the value of that which is boring and as opposed to that which is constantly stimulating. But because it's constantly stimulating, it's not peaceful, right? And so that's just something that I'm dealing with, and how to teach younger generations that which is boring, it's actually beautiful.
I actually have a different sort of take on that, and it comes back to this language confusion, right? In German, there's the word for peace, or the word for satisfaction is Zufriedenheit, and at the core, the etymological core of that is the word Friede, which is peace, which means peace. So it seems like in setting up the aesthetic conditions for flexibility in a city, for meeting the needs of all these different populations, older people, disabled people, children, professionals. If that happens more people will be at peace with themselves or satisfied, and perhaps we can stop, having these kinds of conflictual sorts of confrontations, and kind of gradually move towards more kind of stable, peaceful situations, and we'd all just be happier.
So kind of this external or peace between individuals grows from this internal peace that is maybe linked to the experience of beauty. I like the idea.
Yeah, I think they're kind of they're relational. It's a sort of relational phenomenon, that we are in control of our environments to some degree, and to that degree we should be working towards this ability for people to find contentment, peace with themselves and therefore peace with their neighbors. So this has been a wonderful dialogue. We have to wrap it up, and we're very happy that you joined us. Thank you very much. It's been a great dialogue.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Hopefully we'll see you face to face and get to show you some of the aesthetics of our city here next year.
Looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
And this has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. My name's Jules Simon.
I'm Kim Diaz.
And thank you to our guest once again, Sanna Lehtinen, and hope to see you next time to our viewers.